Hey, hi everyone. Nice to see you. I'm gonna turn my camera off so I can get to the sharing of the screen. Sound. Right. Just a second, make sure everything is. There we go. Everyone can see okay, I hope. So
Yes.
welcome. Thank you for being here. Um, So before I begin, I do want to acknowledge my former colleagues at the Labor Archives, Lynn Bonfield and Karen Lewis, whose work on an exhibition and oral history project for the 50th anniversary of the bridge were foundational resources for this presentation. And as JP noted, there'll be Q&A at the end. The presentation is probably about 35 to 40 minutes. So we'll have plenty of time for you to ask your questions. Okay, so the Golden Gate Bridge was a stupendous feat of engineering and design. It's been called the eighth wonder of the world. We love the bridge for its beauty, but rarely consider who did the work to build it. With this talk, I'd like to take you behind the scenes to look at the complex construction process that created the bridge and the workers who built it. The project required a multitude of skilled tradesmen, carpenters, electricians, pile drivers, divers, ironworkers, along with many laborers who provided the backbreaking support work to these craftsmen. It's built hundreds of feet above the dangerously churning waters of the entrance of the San Francisco Bay. The Golden Gate Bridge was an extremely challenging work site. Several men lost their lives and many others were injured during the 4.5 years it took to build the bridge. Okay, so let's start with the construction process itself. Two anchorages were created to buttress the structure, one on the Marin side and one on the San Francisco side. These anchorages secured the two massive cables the roadway hangs from. To resist the pull of more than 63 million pounds, each cable had to be anchored to a weight more than double that of the pull. Each anchorage contains 64,000 tons of concrete. Together, the two anchorages contained enough concrete to build a 5-foot wide sidewalk from New York to San Francisco. So to create the anchorages, they dug deep pits. Then at the base block of the concrete was poured into this hole. At the rear of this block, 18 steel girders were set, tilting upward away from the gate. Into these girders were pinned eye bars, and at the end of each of these eye bars were what were called strand shoes. They were to hold the cable strands. Once the cable spinning was completed, an anchor block of concrete was poured on top of this assembly, and a weight block was then poured on top of each anchor block to exert a downward pressure on each cable cluster. So to produce this volume of cement, they had to actually build two batching plants for concrete, one on the Marin side and one on the San Francisco side, which you can see here on the left, on the right side. So now, the south tower of the bridge is actually over 1,000 feet offshore. It's the first bridge support ever constructed in open ocean. Excavation for a fender wall in the south tower foundation required drilling and detonation of bedrock under the water. So you see on the left side, there was a drill that repeatedly dropped a 5,000-pound weight down a 120-foot long guiding tube, and that broke down the rock below. When the gravity and concussion had produced a big enough hole at the bottom, then they actually dropped a small bomb down the hole and detonated it, as you can see on the right. So the deep sea divers were amazing. They worked more than 100 feet underwater, quickly, at slack tide only, and they had to complete the excavation for the fender and the tower using hydraulic pressure hoses to clear away the debris from the bombing. Once the site was clean, the huge steel fender forms were dropped into the water and guided into place and secured by the divers. This is the actual equipment that they were using and wearing at the time. This was easily the most dangerous job of the whole process. The divers worked blindly in murky depths while trying to avoid being swept away by fast-changing currents. And they didn't have the diving air tanks that we have today. So the air was actually pumped through a long tube from the surface. As a consequence, they were really limited to only 4 20-minute sessions a day. So initially, an access trestle was built, and a barge at the end of that provided the workstation from which this excavation work could take place. But after several accidents, a fender wall was built to protect the work and eventually the tower itself from the high volume of shipping traffic moving through the gate. The fender is that football-shaped structure you see at the bottom of the tower over here on the right picture, this shape here. The fender wall was built 110 feet below the water surface from the bottom up. And they did it block by block, and these were held together with keys and reinforced steel bars. So when that was completed, solid concrete was then poured inside the wall to a height of 65 feet from the bottom. And then the interior was pumped dry, as you can see on the left picture. And then reinforcing steel for the tower itself was placed and concrete poured to 44 feet above the surface of the water once that was done. So what's interesting is that once the tower was completed, they actually put water back into the space between the fender wall and the tower to disperse the pressure from the tidal flow in the fender wall. I used to always wonder that when I looked down why they did that. It has this water here. So once they finished the fender, they had to begin the actual construction of the tower. These were formed by a series of steel cells. Each was 8 foot by 12 foot by 45 foot. This phase of the work was primarily done by different groups, or they were called gangs, of ironworkers. So each cell was hoisted into position by a traveling derrick, and a raising gang would hook up and align each cell, followed by a connecting gang who would then pound the steel section into place. Then the bolt-up crew would temporarily bolt up about half of the holes, and then the sections were riveted together. There were heaters and forges for the rivets, but they were on the outside of the tower legs, and a heater would cook the rivets and send it through white hot through an aluminum tube to the inside of the cell, where it was caught by a bucker-up, who would then place the rivet using tongs into a hole while the riveter jammed it with an air jack and shaped the round head. Was quite a complicated and impressive process. And there were as many as a dozen riveting gangs working simultaneously. And if you look at the picture on the left, you can see the difference in size. At the bottom, there were 92 cells, but by it got to the top, it was only 21. It's a kind of optical illusion of the thickness of the shapes. As it gets higher, they actually get thinner. Okay, so next came the spinning of the cables. This consisted of pulling out a continuous loop of wire that would be wound around the strand shoe at the anchorage, around the eye bar, and then it would go up and over both towers and around the strand shoe at the opposite anchorage, and then all the way back. When they'd done 226 loops, they on each pair of strand shoes, they were bundled together into what was called a strand, and then each cable consists of 61 strands. So you can see in these photos the various processes that were used to create the cables. And they actually built catwalks below the cables to allow access during construction. You see this in the bottom right-hand photograph. Okay, so cables were completed, and then they actually had to compact them and band them further. And they used the band served as saddles for the suspender cables and ropes that held the actual roadway. So you see in the left-hand picture, that is the saddle that was used to carry the weight of the road. And then once again, the iron workers, the raising, connecting, bolt up, and riveting gangs set to work erecting the suspended steel structure of the roadway. And then you see that image on the right. And I also just want to point out, you see the man that's on the top there, but look below that, that's a person standing on a teeny little ledge on the left side of that piece of metal. Okay. So the final stage of construction involved paving the roadway and painting the structure. Once the road was completed, the catwalks were removed, and pieces of the catwalk were actually given away as souvenirs on the opening day of the bridge. So this is a brochure you see here on the left. It's kind of funny because the brochure extols the beauty and long lifespan of the mighty redwoods, but they were chopped down actually to make the catwalks. And then on the right side, you see for painting, they actually hung from the main cables and lowered themselves using hand crabs. So the bridge was finally completed on May 27th, 1937. It was dubbed Fiesta Day. And the first day the bridge was open, it was solely for pedestrians, aside from some dignitaries driving through. And then the second day was when vehicles were allowed to cross. And I don't know if any of you were here for the 50th anniversary, when the celebration, when they allowed people to walk across the bridge again there, but that was over 300,000 people on the bridge at the same time. It was so heavy that it actually flattened out the span, which was pretty scary for the people that I talked to who were there for that. And one of the things on Fiesta Day is they gave people these wonderful little sort of Fiesta hats. So I'm going to play a little bit of a footage from the opening days that was filmed. Hopefully this will work, and we will go to that. And I'll be sending the links for all of this. So here you can see all the people walking across the span as a group. It's really great footage. They said people lined up at, by 6 a.m. to be the first to go across the bridge. People apparently did roller skated, pogo sticked, all kinds of things to go across. And then this is the dignitaries arriving from both sides for the official celebrations that took place on Crissy Field. Okay. So that's the building of the bridge. So what was happening while the bridge was being built? It was constructed, the construction began in 1933. That was 4 years into the Great Depression, when nearly half of the country's banks had failed and some 13 to 15 million Americans were unemployed, nearly a quarter of all workers. California's unemployment rate was actually 28% in 1932. And in San Francisco, the number of unemployed doubled in 1 year from 30 to 31 and reached its peak in 1933, just as construction began. So the photo on the left is by Otto Hagel. It's what was called the Shape Up. This was people going down to the docks or different places begging for work. And so the competition for the jobs on the Golden Gate Bridge was really pretty brutal. This is a quote by Al Zampa. I can read it real quick. Of down at the bottom of the towers and at the gates, there were dozens of men waiting for the chance for a job. We could see them down there cooking bacon butts and beans in a 5-gallon tin over an open fire. They'd stay there all day waiting for someone to quit, get fired, or fall. So variations of this quote were given in every oral history we have about the bridge in the archives. So it was clearly people felt they needed to do the job and they needed to be careful. And I also want to note Al Zampa, if you've ever driven across the Carquinez Bridge, the official name of that bridge is actually the Al Zampa Memorial Bridge. It is the only bridge in the country that's actually named after a bridge worker. So now the labor context of what was happening during this time period. San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century was a union town, even electing a mayor and board of supervisors under the Union Labor Party in the first decade. But this labor heyday suffered serious pushback after World War II, and we had what were called labor wars during the 1920s. Under the rubric of the American Plan, you can see one of the brochures from this organization, which was spearheaded locally by the San Francisco Industrial Association. Employers pooled their resources and created industry-run employment bureaus in order to break union strongholds, and this was especially true in the construction trades. These already weakened unions were then further undermined by the economic collapse of the Depression. However, despite this grimness, things changed. Thanks to the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NRA, provided the first time federal recognition and protection of a worker's right to a union of their own choosing. This was hailed as labor's Magna Carta, and it helped spur a wave of union organizing across the country. In fact, union membership grew to more than 1 in 4 workers by 1940. But this did not come without struggle. The country was convulsed by violent labor strikes throughout the 1930s. In 1933 alone, over 47,000 agricultural workers went on strike in California's Central Valley. facing armed vigilantes and a crushing police crackdown. So this is a news account from a cotton strike in 1933. And you can see that at the bottom there, this was a Mexican worker who was shot in Pixley during one of the strikes. In San Francisco, longshore workers left company union and organized with their Pacific Coast brethren, fighting a bloody maritime strike that shut down the port of San Francisco and culminated in the death of 2 workers shot by police on July 5th, 1934. This was later known as Bloody Thursday. This is a news account from that. The headline is inaccurate. 2 people actually died. Seen by workers as a war on all of labor, outrage over their deaths helped spark the historic 1934 San Francisco general strike. So all of this was going on as the bridge was being built. So who actually built the bridge? We don't really know. We don't have the exact figures for the number of workers. There were 10 contractors who oversaw the construction, and none of them exist anymore. And according to the Golden Gate Bridge District, there are no surviving employment records. But we do have is this notice for employment. This is in the archives, the labor archives. It states that all applicants for employment on the bridge had to be local residents, had to have US citizenship, and that it was to be an all-union job. The thing is, none of these requirements were actually strictly enforced, although it was a majority the case. I mean, some workers persuaded landlords to vouch for their residency or doctored utility bills. And some workers, like the skilled iron workers, they needed so many of them that they were exempted and they came from all over the United States. There's even accounts, supposedly somebody came as far as Saudi Arabia. And like, who were these workers? What we know from the time period is nearly all of them were probably white. Though in the 1930s, the concept of white was different than what we think about today. It was still very fraught with divisions. Polish, Eastern European, Italian, and Irish workers were still seen as others. And this is reflected in our oral histories. There are casual references to Dago, Frank, and other pejorative terms. Jobs were often obtained through family or friends, and these practices were found in unions where membership was passed down through families. And certain groups dominated certain trades. For example, a large number of the carpenters were Irish. So this protection of clan and privilege played out with the exclusion of Blacks and Asians in the construction unions. And employers exploited racial prejudice by using these groups as strikebreakers. So they reinforced racial barriers over class alliances. And obviously women were excluded as well. There were a minuscule number of women in the construction trades at that time. And the reality is, even in the present day, it's still only around 3%. Okay, so I wanted to show you some photos. This is a scrapbook Fred Matson put together while working on the bridge. He took snapshots. He brought in a little camera and took snapshots of himself and his friends while they were building the bridge. And I think it just gives you an interesting window into the experience. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the photos from this. And this scrapbook has been digitized and is available online. So here you see workers together. Love this shot. It's really beautiful. This is during the cable spinning. And then someone taking a nap. Okay, so the unions, it was an all-union job. This is a list of the main unions that were involved in the construction. And actually, all of these unions still exist today, although the painters are now Local 913 and the Teamsters are Local 350, but otherwise they're still extant. Some of the contractors were actually anti-union, but most were like Pacific Bridge, which hired union and non-union alike, and they allowed unions to solicit membership on site. Whereas the John A. Roebling and Sons, who were the main contractor for the cable spinning, they demanded union membership of all its workers. And the pay, especially for the high skilled work, was very good money for the time. So as you see here, it's $4 for unskilled and $11 a day for skilled. So the working conditions, as I noted earlier, this was a particularly challenging work site, and for all the reasons that are listed here. Workers describe experiencing wildly different temperatures depending on where you were on the bridge. It could be sunny and warm at the top, cold, windy, and foggy down on the roadway. I'm going to play you some clips from the oral histories that we have in the archives. We did a project in the 1987 for the 50th anniversary, interviewing a number of the men who had worked on building the bridge. So all of these also are available online now for you to listen to. And I do want to note that this sound quality, we have it turned up as loud as we can, so hopefully you can hear it well.
The gate was the coldest place I've ever worked in. And that one was, it's one to remember.
Yeah. So that was Martin Adams, and that's his quote. He talks here about you put on all the clothes you could get on, and you worked hard or you'd freeze. And all the workers noted how cold it was. Some described even using newspaper. They would put it inside their clothes to be able to add a layer of insulation. The other particularly grim aspect of working on the bridge were the extreme heights. So this is an amazing photograph we have in the collection. The man on that cable is Fred Brusati, who's an electrician, and behind him is the Marin headlands. That gives you a sense of the scale of the height that they were working at. I mean, the towers actually rose to 746 feet. They're as high as skyscrapers. So I'm going to play again another clip. This is from one of the workers describing being in the construction elevators and getting to the top and riding on them.
Like for an example, when the little platform got overcrowded and there was no room for me, I would stand on what they call the crosshead, which is a small beam about 10 feet above the elevator platform, and you'd stand on that, hold on to the cables, and ride up. And well, I got used to it, but I still felt very much relieved when we hit the roadbed at 4:30 and stamped your feet on the ground.
So there's another story in one of the interviews where the worker describes his first day on the job, going up with a couple of other men in that tiny little elevator, getting all the way to the top, and then you were supposed to step out into this small platform way high up. And he said all three of them looked at each other, and two of them shook their heads and said, and quit. Whereas he was so desperate for work, he said he took the job, and eventually he, like this John Noren, got used to the heights. So some other factors that played into the working conditions were the production pressures. There had been several accidents at the beginning of the bridge, not with people being injured, but the causeway was swept away by a storm. Anyway, it delayed the construction process, and so they were trying to make up time. So, for example, the steel company, McClintock Marshall, earned $1,500 a day for each day the tower was brought in under the existing deadline. And so this really created pressure to work fast. For example, there was a quota implemented for the number of rivets you had to do each day. And so the cables in the tower construction were actually completed ahead of schedule. I do want to note that this pressure to finish quickly will figure into one of the most significant events that occurred during the construction of the bridge, which I will go into later. So, safety precautions. During this time period, it was a general rule of thumb that for one death for every $1 million of construction was not considered unusual. So the bridge cost $35 million to build, meaning 35 deaths would not have been seen as out of the ordinary. However, during the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge, model worker safety practices were put into place. Workers were required to wear hard hats, you see here in the picture. They were made of leather at that time, but several of the workers noted how important it was having these hats. I mean, one of the real dangers when you work on a bridge is being hit by falling objects, whether it's hammers or rivets or whatever. So workers also were required to wear harnesses and belts or be tied in. And some accounts indicated that a worker would be fired if they didn't follow these safety protocols. However, some other ones said that they hated being tied in. One guy actually likened it to being a goat at the end of a tether, and he said he flouted the rules. I will point out in this photo, you see the man on the right side in the front, he is not wearing a hard hat. So clearly people did not always wear the various safety features. So I want to talk next about the really big thing that made a difference in this construction process, and that is the safety net. You see these various photos here of the net. It wasn't a new idea. It's the Iron Workers Union had actually pushed for it frequently, but employers just didn't want to spend the money. And now, because so many people were saved by it, there's a lot of different people take credit for the safety of the net, for the safety net, excuse me. But the contractor Roebling was probably the one that actually did it, since they initiated most of this safety measures, and they were all union. So the safety net cost $130,000, but it saved the lives of 19 men who fell into it. They called themselves the Halfway to Hell Club, which I love the name. And that Al Zampo, who I mentioned before, he was one of those 19. He actually fell into the net and it sagged all the way to the ground. He actually hit the ground, but it saved him from dying, but he was pretty badly injured from it. So the net was effective, especially when you consider the Bay Bridge, which was built roughly in the same time period, but they didn't have a net and they were not all union. As many as 25 workers were killed building the Bay Bridge. And when I talked with one of the head of the Iron Workers Union, he noted that setting the safety net was actually one of the most dangerous jobs on the project because obviously there was nothing to catch you. I also wanted to kind of talk about, they live with this danger every day, and it certainly affected them and it affected their family members. So when we did the oral history project, a couple of the wives of the workers were also part of the interviews. So I'm going to play a poignant quote from Alvina McIntyre. She was one of the wives of the workers.
Well, that when he kissed me goodbye in the morning to go to work, I never knew if he was coming home for dinner.
You can hear one of the other wives in the background say, "That's right." Right. So they lived with it. And now I really want to try to play a bit of footage. It's from the Smithsonian documentary that shows the footage in the construction actually in play, which is, it's interesting to be able to see it, not just in photographs. So I'm going to go ahead and open this and hopefully it will work. It's been colorized, I think. So that's the tower under construction. And you can see that's them guiding work. There's the catwalk in place. And that's the cable spinning. That's what that looks like. So you can see them laying it down, and then this gives you a sense of the danger of really how on the edge they were actually working. And that's more of the cable spinning. And you see the men on the right, the left over there walking down. And now this man is actually hooking himself in. And there's the safety net. And that's them setting the safety net. And again, you can see the precariousness of the work. The clip for that, or the link for that, will also, I think JP will put it in the chat. Okay. So there weren't just the fear of accidents, there were actually real health hazards during the construction of the bridge. The primer paint used was actually lead-based. And then the heat from riveting and scraping the paint released the lead, and the cramped working conditions, remember those cells were very tiny, and poor ventilation intensified the exposure. And there was severe illness for many of the workers at the first stages of the construction. Men reported being nauseous and pain and having cramps, and believe it or not, it was actually diagnosed as a mass appendicitis. Fortunately, the California Industrial Safety Commission investigated, and they documented several cases of lead poisoning. And this resulted in important workplace changes. And from then on, no lead was to be applied to the surfaces that would be riveted. Compressed air was pumped into the tower cells, and riveters were given filter masks, as seen in this picture. One other thing about being in those cramped quarters in the cells was the loud noise of the reverberation, and that resulted in serious hearing loss for a number of men. They actually nicknamed it riveter's disease. Okay. So despite the model safety measures put in place, several workers did die building the bridge. This is a poem written by Hubert Johnson. I found this in the Fred Dumatson scrapbook. It was written sometime before actually both of the bridges were completed. And I just wanted to read a section of it because I think it speaks to, there's a lot of buildings, dams, public works that were built by workers, and we rarely consider the dangers that they faced doing this work. So we boastfully portray how man, through engineering skill, has spanned our mighty bay. But while we praise and boast of them, a newsboy shrilly cries, "In accidental fall on bridge, another worker dies." In everybody's daily work, they sometimes take a chance, but these unsung heroes of the bridge, each hour must with death must dance. Just one false step, a scream, a thud, then silent cants its gloom. When these mighty bridges are opened amid ceremonies gay, when bands blare forth in tuneful strains and oratory fills the air, let us pause in our rejoicing to offer up a prayer for those brave men who gave their lives that you and I might say, San Francisco does know how. We've bridged the bay. So the first person to die on the bridge was Kermit Moore. It occurred on October 30, 1936, so nearly 4 years into the construction process. He was a 23-year-old San Franciscan who worked for Bethlehem Steel. He died while working on laying the steel structure for the roadway. A pin came loose on a traveling crane, which then collapsed, and its boom swung out and killed him. So the construction stopped, and all the workers went home. This was a custom of bridge workers. Sadly, and one of the workers chillingly noted that when this didn't happen when he worked in the lumber industry, there were too many deaths. This is all before OSHA. So there were many other accidents that happened. One of the worst, which could have been far more catastrophic, was when a 7-ton locomotive hauling concrete across the bridge, it involved that. The bridge had a high peak in the middle before it was completed, and it meant that the locomotive had to pick up steam to get up and over the middle, which resulted in it getting very high speed on the other side going down. And then on a particularly wet day, the brakes failed. And so it just hurtled completely out of control and jumped the rails on the Marin side. Fortunately, no one was injured, but the oral histories contain some pretty wild accounts of people jumping off literally at the last minute before it crashed. So the bridge's largely stellar safety record came to a horrible end on February 17th, 1937. As the bridge neared completion, carpenters and laborers were removing the wooden forms that were used in pouring the concrete roadbeds. They were using a movable stripping platform underneath the roadway. The stripping platform gave way, plunging 12 men into the water, killing 10. So this is a photo from the San Francisco Examiner illustrating the accident. This is supposed to be a real photo that you see the safety net in the water, and those little arrows are supposed to be the workers who were trapped in the net as it went down. You see the names of the 10 workers who were killed, and one of them included Fred Dumatson. Some of the workers described the platform as being jury-rigged and not in keeping with the rest of the care taken for the bridge work, due to the rush to complete the construction of the bridge before the May opening date. So this is where that accelerated work schedule comes into play. The contractor Pacific Bridge had been warned about problems with the platform, and in fact, the morning of the accident, industrial safety commissioners were on their way, literally on their way to inspect the scaffolding, but they were too late. After an investigation, the Industrial Accident Commission found that the bolts were at fault. Counter accusations of guilt were levied between the contractor and the engineers, but no one was ever charged. So here's Fred. I would do wanna point, that's him on up top the bridge, and then this is in the scrapbook, this is a photo of his parents, grieving for him. And we were fortunate to actually be able to interview Slim Lambert. Slim was one of the 12 men who actually went into the water, and he's one of two who survived. And in this recording, which I'll play a clip of, it's Slim talking about trying to save Fred Dumatson.
I had a choice. There were 2 or 3 people floating around when I finally got myself together and gathered up a couple of boards trying to stay afloat. And I went to him because he was still thrashing about and I knew he was alive. The others appeared to be done for. So I got a hold of him and I got him up on a couple of boards. And then I was going to see what I could do for others. But the minute I'd let go of him, the boards would go and he'd start to go down. So I decided, better stick with what you got, because I knew he was alive. So I stayed with him. The others disappeared. And then when the crab fishermen came by and spotted us, why, he had an awful time getting Fred aboard, and then he had a hard time getting me aboard because I had a broken shoulder and ribs and broken neck, and, I was a wreck. But he managed to get us into that boat and bring us ashore.
So that's an incredibly powerful interview, and it's heartbreaking that kind of danger happened, right? When they could have easily taken more care with the stripping platform. And after the bridge was completed, the labor community held a grand labor ball at the Civic Auditorium for the opening festivities. And all of the proceeds from that went to the families of the workers who were killed during the construction. And there's paperwork in the archives that shows that like the Dumatson family got very little money. I mean, basically the last paycheck and a small, very small payoff. So the labor community came together to support them. And then when the bridge was completed, they held a memorial the Sunday after the opening celebrations. I've never read this account anywhere, but it's in the labor newspaper that there was a boy and a girl from every school in the city, and they carpeted the water beneath the bridge with flowers. Representatives of every union that worked on the bridge were there, along with the family of those killed. And the newspaper, the Labor Clarion of the Labor Council, noted that a memorial plaque was unveiled at the toll plaza to, quote, stand as long as the bridge stands. So here you see in this photo, that's the plaque. The plaque is now unfortunately located on the west side of the bridge. It's the side, if you ride your bike, you'll pass that. Most people don't notice it though. So I think, again, speaking to the idea of both this presentation and wanting to honor the workers who sacrificed their lives. So that's it. I'm going to end with fittingly a quote from one of the workers about how they themselves saw the bridge. And this is again Slim Lambert.
Everybody that worked on the bridge knew it was special. Everybody. I'm sure any man that ever had anything to do with that bridge thought of it as his bridge.
Okay. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine, so much. We're open to hear some questions coming in. Hi, Catherine. Go Gators. You stated bridge workers were white. Wondering if the 1934 longshoremen strike resulting in integration of the docks, inviting both Black and Asian laborers into the union for the first time, had any impact on racial integration on the bridge work?
I don't know that specifically, but the Longshore Union, I mean, they didn't actually work in construction. They were working on loading and unloading ships and down on the docks. And they were one of the more militant and radical unions at that time. And so I think they could often be in opposition to some of the more conservative unions at that time. So I don't know that as far as I know, I don't think it changed things at that point. One thing I will let people know, we're really lucky. We digitized both through the help through the construction unions, Organized Labor, which is the newspaper of the San Francisco Building Trades Council, and we've also digitized the Labor Clarion, the newspaper of the San Francisco Labor Council. And those are both now available through the California Digital Newspaper Collection. So if you just Google that, you can search through those, and that's one way to really understand the sort of culture, what were the events happening at the same time. It's a really wonderful resource.
And you got a bunch of thank yous. And another question, you stated 19 workers, the Halfway to Hell Club, were saved by the Golden Gate Bridge net. You then stated that the Bay Bridge workers not unionized had no nets and 25 laborers were killed. Will you please clarify, were those 25 killed during the Bay Bridge construction killed by falling?
It was various accidents, I think falling was one of them, but there were definitely other aspects to, I think, how people died. But it's a very hard figure to get. I remember going to, it's certainly not on the website, whereas the Golden Gate Bridge has, and I'll recommend this, they have a very extensive website looking at the history of the bridge, and they're a little more open about it. But yeah, it's, I think there were, I think the oral histories that we have, some of the workers worked on both bridges. So they talk about some of their experiences and things they witnessed.
Okay, and another more kudos to you. And was there ever any threat to halt working on the bridge by workers due to the safety concerns, et cetera?
I don't remember hearing anything like that. I mean, I think part of that quote that I showed at the beginning with Al Zampa, where he talked about, looking down and there are all these people waiting for the job. I think that's one of the things that people felt enormous pressure to be, to not complain, to just get the work done and keep your job. I mean, that was part of the strike that happened, the maritime strike and then general strike was in part because people were tired of working injured, not having the shape up, not having any say, whereas at least with the unions, there were hiring halls and there were more protections. So, I mean, there's that, when I brought up the issue of the safety net and who takes credit for it, you'll see in a lot of the official stories, they talk about Joseph Strauss, the main engineer, and other folks for taking credit. But I think it really was the iron workers were the ones that pushed for this. They're the ones that were most vulnerable, and they, advocated for it. So I don't have complete documentation of that, but that's, I think, seems likely. I mean, honestly, OSHA, all the safety protections, most of that came from workers demanding it.
And I want to remind people, if you want to unmute yourself, you can also ask, not through the chat, but you can ask. And here's a really nice one, Catherine. Someone writes, I would like to note that I'm watching this presentation with my 97-year-old mother who walked the bridge with her sister on the opening day. My mother and I have found this very interesting. That's lovely.
That's great. That's great. That's amazing. It's the footage and the stories from the opening day were quite amazing. I think the city in some ways shut down. Like it was such a huge deal for the bridge finally being completed. And I think it was also not a public works job, which people don't understand the Bay Bridge was, but the Golden Gate Bridge was the district. It was money, bonds were raised, and the money from that which was used to build the bridge. So.
Someone asks, are there records of how many workers got lead poisoning, deaths due to lead poisoning?
Oh, I can't say that off the top of my head. There may be, we do have in the archives some of the safety reports from the larger California body. I know there was one report that was talking about the safety net. I'd have to go back, to see whether I have direct access or not, but,
And go ahead.
Nice. I was just seeing Ruth's question about the pay.
Oh, yeah, you see it. Yes.
Yeah. So the pay for non-skilled was about $4 a day, and for skilled, it was $11. At least that was what we were given to understand. So,
any other questions or comments? And again, if you want to unmute yourself instead of typing it in the chat, please do so.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, raise your. And again, if you
Um,
didn't know, this is all being recorded, and we will send a link to the recording as well as the slides after the presentation.
And like I said, you can go to our website and look at listen to all the full oral histories. Harvey Schwartz did the oral history interviews, and they were also published in a book. So if you want to read them, there we have transcripts as well. But if you want to read them, that's just look for Harvey's book.
And
Mhm.
there's one in the chat for you. They're wondering what the work schedules were like. Was it a Monday through Friday, 8-hour shifts?
Yes, it was a daytime. Some of them talk about leaving at like 4 or 4:30. So I think they actually started earlier, and ended a little bit earlier. That generally in construction trades, it seems like they start earlier and end earlier.
Anyone else? Now's your time. No more kudos.
Thank you.
Just lovely. The pictures that I've, done a lot of research myself on the bridge, but some of the stuff you've brought today I've never seen before, and just it's lovely. It's really neat to see it.
Pretty much everything except for the clips I linked to, all of that material is in the archives. I really recommend taking a look at Fred Dumatson's scrapbook. It's really quite meaningful. And what's lovely is his family members, people from Germany, have come to the archives to see the scrapbook because they're so amazed that Fred's story is known and is now out there. They're really thrilled by that. He was a young man. The scrapbook's fascinating too because it's not just the building of the bridge. You see him camping, and it's just a kind of window into the 30s in a way that's pretty interesting. And the oral histories are the same thing. They're not just about the bridge, they're life histories. So if you really kind of want to know about someone's a life like that, like some of them started out doing other work or went into other work afterwards, or what it was like to come to San Francisco. It's they're really wonderful documentation of people's lives from the past.
And another one, I don't know if you see that in the chat, Catherine, I can read it to you as well.
Yeah. The netting extended, oh yeah, directly under the bridge, but it did go out the other side. There are different parts to the netting. I can't go back to the photos, but if you go to the website too for the Golden Gate Bridge, because they have some of the photos as well. When we did an exhibition in 1987, we got the negatives and reproduced a lot of the photos. That's why we have them in the archives. But they're not everything, and they have some additional photos. So, yeah, it was set in different ways. It wasn't just one thing. I mean, they moved it and they put it in place for different parts of the construction process.
Someone asked Catherine, where did the workers take their breaks? Lunch on the bridge?
Nobody asked the question, where did they go to the bathroom? We actually have photographs of they had these toilets that they were up there on the catwalk. That was one of the things. The catwalk was the sort of thoroughfare and the place where they were. But breaks, that photo I showed of that guy taking a nap, that's really what was going on. He was taking a break that way. So I think they basically stayed on the bridge and took their breaks. It was too much work getting up and down and off to be able to really go anywhere to go get something to eat. I was just reading an article that was talking about the demise of the lunch break, and I think it's kind of an interesting aspect of things. So yeah, they definitely, I think, ate on the bridge and brought their food with them.
Anybody else?
Thank you. Yeah, the photos are great. I've loved the bridge ever since I can remember. And I actually worked at Bank of America for a while in their corporate archives, and they had some of the material. AP Giannini from the bank was one of the main forces behind the bond that allowed the bridge to be built. So it was a significant piece. And I want to put a plug in for Charles Ellis. Everyone focuses on Joseph Strauss as the designer of the bridge. It was really this man, Charles Ellis. He was the person who actually had the skill set and the ability to do that. There's a great book by John Vanderzee about it's just called The Gate that really uncovers that story, and it's quite fascinating. So
Anyone else before we wrap it up? Please feel free to either ask in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask away.
okay.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine.
Yeah, it was great.
It was really great. I appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And again, we'll be sending a link to the recording along with the slides, and it'll include the links to the archives and the scrapbook and all that stuff. So you'll get all that either later today or tomorrow.
Oh, and just a plug for the Labor Archives, we're at San Francisco State in the main library, and it's open to the public. And, if you're interested in the Bay Area's labor history, we have a lot of amazing material. Just generally, especially in the summer, email us ahead of time to make an appointment to come in. But we encourage folks to come. Okay.
And a plug for our own collection here. I know you've used some of the pictures from our historical archives. There's lots and lots of stuff in there. So if you're curious, we'll satiate your curiosity.
Thanks, Denise. All right, you guys, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.